last day, last section, to a few people. We may have more of an interactive meeting if you want. You can intervene anytime you want. In this presentation, I'm going to be addressing the dopaminergic system in a couple of ways. Dopamine and brain rewarding system, dopamine and craving, dopamine and attention. And of course the other field is genetic research and epigenetic mechanisms. Research performed during the last 25 years has studied neurobiological dependence, especially in those who use a substance for a long period of time. There are some neuroadaptive changes, and then when the substance is suddenly discontinued, people continue to take that substance because of the deprivation effect. Again, many neurotransmitter systems have joint impacts in the development of this dependency. GABA, glutamate, noradrenaline, but dopamine has been the most popular neurotransmitter that has been studied. In preclinical and clinical research has shown that dopamine, a widespread neurotransmitter in CNS, has played an important role in the development and sustainability of dependency. Especially it has to do with the motivational aspect and brain rewarding system of substance use. As I said at the beginning, brain imaging and research, pharmacological research, are performed under three headings. First of all, dopamine and brain rewarding system, the changes that emerge there, and then craving and dopamine, and then substance-dependent, the indirect impact of dopamine on cognitive processes like attention. Dopamine has an impact and plays a role in the development of substance addiction. And then there's genetic research, and here as well, all neurotransmitter systems, among all of these, dopamine and dependency relationship is one of the highest relationship levels. And then there's a new area, epigenetic studies. It's the cellular core nucleus that is of interest here. In dopamine and brain rewarding system, this is something even beyond addiction. Beyond addiction, there are many studies about this, especially as of beginning of 90s, dopamine equals pleasure. This is the principle we have departed from. So people working in experimental psychology have carried out a lot of studies. In these studies in general, the addiction-developing substances induce pleasure and increase dopamine. This has been shown. This is the general information we have. Substances and the mechanisms they have an impact on opiates, on neuroreceptors, ethanol, GABA, and NMDA. So many substances in general have an impact on a certain neurotransmitter system. But apart from this main neurotransmitter system, the substances, once they impact the neurotransmitter system, then they also have an impact on mesolimbic dopamine system, so that the rewarding effect of the substance can emerge. Alcohol, cocaine, morphine, they have an impact on different neurotransmitters, but they activate mesolimbic dopamine system, and they play a role in the formation of a substance dependency. The first trial in this area, the pleasurable effects of substances are impacted by dopamine. With the development of brain imaging techniques, dopamine release and endogenous dopamine release from the striatum has to do with the pleasure that is derived from the substance. Brain imaging studies have emerged to the foreground. Oswald et al., for instance, have a trial. Amphetamine intake increases striatal dopamine, and of course this has to do with taking pleasure from that substance, as patients have reported. Nora Walcall has a lot of studies on this brain rewarding system and rewarding relationship. People who take pleasure from amphetamine use, for instance, have less dopamine too than those who do not report as much pleasure from using it. In ventral striatum, there's more dopamine release, and high amount of extracellular dopamine and low dopamine receptor has to do with the pleasure-inducing effects of the substance. Apart from this, dopamine equals pleasure. There are some studies who do not report this. These are outside the scope of dependency. For instance, Parkinson's disease, a serious disruption of this system. Even the pleasure they derive from food is different from the control group. So this has been repeated in a lot of trials. Many psychopharmacological trials have shown that when dopamine receptors are blocked by antipsychotics, the pleasure derived from the substance didn't change, but there has been a change in the desire for the substance. PET trials have shown that dopamine levels has to do with craving for the substance rather than deriving pleasure from it. As a result, dopamine and brain rewarding system. In conclusion, dopamine equals pleasure principle. The scientists have reviewed this. Dopamine, rather than deriving substance from the substance, deriving pleasure from the substance, it has something to do with craving for the substance. And dopamine and brain rewarding are not enough in explaining addiction, so therefore the second thing had to do with the relationship between dopamine and craving. Substance-dependent craving, it continues for a number of years after discontinuation of the substance. So in the neurotransmitter pathways, there have been some permanent changes intracellularly, it makes us think. Dopamine and craving relationship has been experienced on animals and then humans. These are brain imaging studies, but dopamine and craving have to do with pharmaceutical trials. And brain imaging, from nicotine to cocaine, depending on the chronic use of many substances, there have been some adaptive changes in the mesolimbic dopaminergic system, D1 receptor and D2 receptor. There's reduction and also reduction in striatal dopamine release. Dopamine release and receptor count are reduced, so bromocriptine, a dopamine agonist, has been tried on cocaine users, and some conflicting results have been obtained. There are 18 trials. Suarez and et al. Have assessed these with a meta-analysis, and dopamine agonists are generally different from placebo in craving, they have reported. When dopamine agonists were no use, then there have been conducted some trials on dopamine antagonists. As of the beginning of the 90s, there's been many trials. Haloperidol and flopentixol, typical antipsychotics, have been found efficacious in animal models, especially flopentixol, because towards the end of the 90s, and several studies, especially in cocaine it has been shown to reduce cocaine-seeking behavior, but later studies could not repeat the same result. Again, haloperidol and olanzapine reduced substance craving. Apart from these, there are also publications which indicate it's no different from the placebo. It's like dopamine antagonists are better than dopamine agonists, but results are in conflict with one another. Dopamine and craving relationship. Another hypothesis about this is that this has to be addressed from two different aspects. Some say craving, sudden craving and chronic craving can be separated into two. In chronic craving, there may be dopamine deficiency, whereas in sudden craving, there is a temporary increase, and partial dopamine agonists may be beneficial for this. Now, of course, naltrexone and aripiprazole have been studied for this. Naltrexone has been found as efficacious as aripiprazole. We had a presentation about alcohol and substance dependency, and he also quoted this trial. This is a new trial. It has not been repeated. It's just one comparison study, and aripiprazole has been found to be as efficacious as naltrexone. It should be repeated in other trials, of course. Dopamine and craving relationship is not too clear, but when you're exposed to the substance for a long period of time, the dopaminergic changes that emerge are explained by the brain rewarding system. Another thing is that dopamine and cognitive functions. Here, this is mostly experimental psychologists that study this. The general hypothesis is, in a way, dopamine is like ADHD syndrome. in such processes, dopamine's role has already been shown. Because of that, they were wondering whether dopamine indirectly draws the attention to the substance and then induces dependency. They researched this, and in dependence, there's attention selection towards the substance. For instance, in heroin dependence, when you give them 2 milligram haloperidol, their attention towards stimulus that have to do with the substance have been reduced. Again, with heroin dependence, heroin addicts, when you draw their attention, sorry, there's a question, but we can't hear it because it's not being asked into a microphone. Things that will remind the person of substance use. They tell them some things. When given haloperidol, their attention to such stimulus gets reduced. Substance-related stimuli, things that will remind them of their days when they used to abuse that substance. In heroin addictions, those who responded more to these stimuli had more recurrences. Selective attention herhalde madde dikkate almış. Neurodol, haloperidol, is it a general suppression by them, or is it a substance-related reaction? Is it reduced specifically? Dopamine attention relationship is being studied by experimental psychologists. So dopamine has to do with attention processes. This patient is not under the influence of the substance, but you remind them of related stimuli. And among some substance addicts, those who pay attention show more recurrences compared to those who don't pay attention to such stimuli. So they say that those who are more attention selective have more recurrences, or it has an indirect impact on dependency. Dopamine causes that person to turn their attention to that, so they have more recurrences. So I can't hear. An addict in situations that trigger the desire to use that substance. This is experimental, isn't it? There's very few human trials, not many direct studies on addicts. Another area is, the first two areas have to do with brain imaging and pharmacological research. In genetic research, this is the third leg. They examine dependency and genetical relationship. Positive data is obtained from dopamine again. There are three things. One is dopamine receptor genetic changes. Second is dopamine carrier system, some genetic differences there. And third is the genetic differences in enzymes that ensure dopamine destruction, that break down dopamine. Is there a difference between polymorphisms they studied? Particularly what they underline most is dopamine 2 receptor. Many studies have been performed, meta-analyses also, especially Smith et al. Have performed a meta-analysis. A1 and A1A2 genotype people are under 1.38 risk compared to A1 people. These are relationships between opioid, psychostimulant and opioid addiction. Another system, dopamine carrying system genetic differences. On the DAT gene, there's variable nucleotide tandem repeat polymorphism. And of course, many of the studies have to do with cocaine, because cocaine is directly related with DUT inhibition. So studies have yielded conflicting results. This DUT VNTR polymorphism is found to be very important by some, and then not at all important by others. One or two studies may be not directly related to cocaine addiction, but it's the emerging paranoia and methamphetamine use dependent psychosis and polymorphism relationship, especially in 9-9 repeat polymorphism individuals, euphoria and anxiety feelings do not emerge. In some genetic polymorphism, anxiety emerges to the foreground. Another thing is the dopamine breaking down enzymes, dopamine beta-indexylase or methyltransferase monoamino oxidase. There are genetic polymorphisms here. In the beta-H knockout rats, there's increased sensitivity about the rewarding effects of cocaine. Again, a D beta-H inhibitor, dilsulfiramine, has been found to be beneficial in the treatment of cocaine addiction, and which may be effective in the treatment of cocaine addicts. 689 cocaine addicts and 832 controls have been compared, and this D-beta-H 1021CT polymorphism has shown no differences. COMT Val 158 mate polymorphism, low enzyme activity related. 158 mate allele carrying cocaine people are under more risk for cocaine addiction, it has been shown, and MAO less trials. It has been shown to have something with nicotine addiction, but genetic differences, not enough trials showing any relation. So it has to do with receptor. Dopamine receptancy has to do with receptor. There are not too many studies with dopamine enzymes, and more studies have yielded negative results compared with positive results. Epigenetic mechanisms. Savit Bey had a wonderful presentation about this, genetic mechanisms and psychiatry relationships. Here's what we mean by this. If there's, without any change in the DNA code, methylation, acetylation, S-phosphorylation, it changes gene activity. This is called epigenetics. A special Texas University team has carried out a lot of research, especially cell culture and animal studies, and in general what they research the most is the cocaine. They have identified two transcription factors. One is CREB, the other is delta phos-B. Delta phos-B, when there's chronic exposure to cocaine, its effect is prolonged, and of course it explains craving and reinstatement. In the addiction, we know the substance is craved. People who have been exposed to the substance for a long time, then discontinued, when they start years later, they can immediately go back to the same level. So this may explain the cell nucleus level changes. As you can see, the receptors we know better, for second messengers also things we know better, but what's happening in the cell nucleus, that's not something we know much about. Substance-related cell nucleus targeting genes may be there, and there are transcription factors, and through their impact there are some stable or permanent changes in the neuron. What are those? That CREB, phos, Shun-like transcription factors. Why are these important? Mesler and friends had a trial when cell culture is subjected to cocaine for 5 days or 4 weeks. Transcription factor regulating genes change. For instance, when there's 5-day exposure, there's more CREB-like genes are more effective. CREB transcription factor regulating gene number is approximately 19. Delta phos is 4, but when you expose for 4 weeks, delta phos-B gene mediated factors increase. There's no change in the genetic structure of the cell, but the transcription factor is activated, and this activation explains the reinstatement in the coming back of addiction. So very good studies. Human trials, very few, for instance. In fact, your time is up, but it's my last slide. I can't see Ayhan. We can. Well, I'm almost done. Last slide. Only trial that has been done. DAT gene expression, methylation dependent increase, and has to do with craving and alcohol dependency. published in 2009. When reviewing dopamine effects, not only extracellular dopamine, but also dopamine in the cell, how it's impacted has to be studied. In conclusion, increasing dopamine effect has been known for a long time. Genetic and epigenetic trials have yielded some data about development of dependence and dopamine. Of course, when dopamine is having an impact, it causes the development of dependency, but it's not the only influential transmitter. From GABA to others, it's a joint effect of many neurotransmitters. So dopaminergic system has an important role in dependency. Thank you very much.